The rule of history is almost universally cruel. Great civilizations fall, their languages die, and their monuments are consumed by the sand. But one single civilization broke this rule. Over 2.5 millennia, the land we now call Iran was invaded by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. They marched in with swords drawn, burned capitals, and slaughtered populations. Yet, instead of erasing the locals, the invaders ended up wearing their clothes, speaking their language, and adopting their bureaucracy. How does a civilization manage to eat its conquerors? The answer starts in the dirt. The Iranian plateau is 1 million square miles of mountain steppe and salt desert, ringed by stone. It acts as a massive natural fortress, sitting directly at the crossroads of East and West. Inside that fortress, an Indo-Iranian people developed a unique worldview. Through the Zoroastrian faith, they became the first major culture to view time as a linear path rather than a repeating circle. History had a definitive beginning, and it was marching toward a final judgment, a cosmic war between the forces of light and dark. To live on this plateau meant being an active soldier for the light. That intense cultural unity birthed the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great. By the 6th century BC, it stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, forming the world's first superpower. But their real innovation was administrative tolerance. They allowed conquered peoples to keep their local gods and customs, building an empire on pragmatic respect rather than sheer terror. To manage millions of diverse subjects, they invented the satrapy system, dividing the empire into provinces ruled by local governors called satraps, who answered directly to the king. They linked these provinces with a 1,700-mile royal road, allowing couriers to deliver messages across the continent in a week. They built a machine of statecraft that was standardized, robust, and highly lucrative. By the 4th century BC, that blueprint was deeply entrenched in the soil. Anyone who managed to breach the mountain fortress would quickly realize the administrative machine they just conquered was far too valuable to tear down. The first stress test arrived with Alexander of Macedon. In 330 BC, his armies snatched the Persian forces and burned the grand capital of Persepolis. But almost immediately, Alexander adopted Persian court dress, integrated Iranian nobles into his command, and demanded his Greek officers bow in the traditional Persian ritual. After his death, his Greek successors built gymnasiums and tried to Hellenize the region. But out in the villages, the Persian dialects and fire temples persisted. Eventually, local Iranian tribes pushed the Greeks out and reclaimed the plateau. By the 3rd century AD, a new native dynasty called the Sasanians took control. They centralized power, elevated Zoroastrianism into a rigid state religion, and waged 400 years of war against Rome and Byzantium. At their peak, they captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive, carving his surrender into stone for eternity. Centuries of war exhausted the Sasanian state. In the mid-7th century, Arab tribes united under the banner of Islam swept across the plateau. They killed the last native king, brought a new faith, and introduced Arabic as the language of power. Rather than disappearing, the locals executed a quiet reconquest from within. The new Arab caliphate needed a way to manage its massive territories, and the Persians had centuries of experience running empires. Iranian administrators flooded the new capital of Baghdad, installing their ancient bureaucratic methods at the very center of Islamic rule.
As political power fragmented, Eastern courts began funding scholars who wrote in a refined, modern version of the Persian language. Thinkers like Avicenna mapped the human body and Aristotelian logic, while poets like Ferdowsi wrote a 60,000-verse mythic history of Iran. The plateau adopted the new religion, but it refused to abandon its cultural identity. Persians remained Persians. They took Islam and wrapped it in their own aesthetic and administrative traditions, creating a distinct Persianate culture that spread from Istanbul to India. Then came the 13th century. Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes tore through the region. They stacked human skulls into pyramids and systematically destroyed the underground irrigation channels that kept the desert at bay. Millions died. Even facing total demographic collapse, the cultural machine survived. Genghis Khan's descendants realized living in a tent couldn't compare to the luxuries of a Persian court. They began commissioning exquisite miniature paintings, hiring local scholars, and adopting the very administrative systems their grandfathers had tried to burn down. By the time the Timurid warlords took over in the 14th century, the transformation was complete. These fierce steppe warriors were funding massive blue-domed mosques, studying advanced mathematics, and using Farsi as their official state language. The Timurid capital of Herat blossomed into a center of intellectual gravity. They built observatories calculating the solar year to within minutes of modern precision, while their artists perfected the delicate, jewel-like style of Persian miniature painting. The land was ravaged, the canals were dry, and the ruling class was entirely foreign. Yet the underlying civilization digested its invaders whole, turning ruthless horse lords into the greatest patrons of Persian high art. In 1501, a native dynasty finally reclaimed power. The Safavids unified the plateau and took a radical step to protect it. They made Shia Islam the official state religion. This created a hard, permanent cultural wall separating them from the massive Sunni Ottoman Empire pressing in from the west. By the 19th and 20th centuries, those walls cracked. The British and Russian empires treated the region as a geopolitical chessboard, stripping away territory and extracting millions of barrels of oil. The nation was carved into separate spheres of influence, suffocating under colonial weight. To survive this new industrial world, the Pahlavi dynasty attempted rapid modernization, backed heavily by the United States and Britain. But to millions of citizens, these aggressive top-down reforms felt like an erasure of their heritage. The leadership had adopted the aesthetic of the West, alienating the very people they ruled. In 1979, the societal pressure cooker exploded. Millions took to the streets in a revolution that dismantled the monarchy entirely. It was a violent rejection of foreign interference, fueled by decades of exploitation and a desire to reclaim sovereign identity. The resulting theocracy severed ties with the West and built an uncompromising state apparatus. Stripped of its modern political context, this isolationist stance is the ancient fortress mindset reasserting itself, a harsh mechanism designed to repel outside influence at any cost. Today, the state known as Iran is defined by geopolitical tension, borders, and sanctions. But the concept of Persia operates on an entirely different timeline. It is an immortal cultural phenomenon, a civilization that learned thousands of years ago that the surest way to defeat an invading enemy is to simply make them want to be you.